Sir, we can start now.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, friends and colleagues. I welcome you all to this evening webinar as a moderator. This is the 26th webinar in our series, and I'm happy to say that we continued this tradition of holding webinars every Sunday without a break during these days of the pandemic. Today, we shall have a talk on from mapping the journey of textual appreciation from stylistics to critical stylistics. And I'd like to make a note that this webinar session is being recorded, so you are requested to attend the entire session. A feedback link is sent to your email, but not during the session. And if it is not possible to attend the entire session to anyone, the recorded video is shared to your email to get benefit to you as YouTube link. And now I request Dr. Shravan Ji to play the video on ELTAI. Over to you, Dr. Shravan Ji. Thank you for the video, Dr. Shravan Ji. I'm sure all of you know how much work is being done by our association. Without keeping of any time, let me introduce to you the speaker of the day, Dr. Anindya Shyam Chaudhary, Associate Professor from the Department of English, Assam University, Silchar, Assam. And I would like to share a few words about Dr. Anindya Shyam Chaudhary is an Associate Professor from the Department of English, Assam University, Silchar, and he has a PhD in English, a postgraduate certificate in the teaching of English, PGCT, and a postgraduate diploma in the teaching of English, PGDTE, from the EFL University, Hyderabad. In addition, he also has a Trinity College London certificate, TESOL, and he has presented papers in international conferences like Asia, TEFL, and in Kuching, Malaysia, and in Nanjing, China, Asian EFL, and Nile TESOL, and Black Sea ELT Conference, English Scholars Beyond Borders Conference, etc. He has also contributed articles to several journals of reputation. His current areas of interest, including world English and the politics of English in post-colonial contexts, and language, literature, interface areas like stylistics and post-colonial literatures in English, especially writings in English from India's Northeast. Now, I would like to invite the speaker to deliver the lecture today. Over to you, sir.
And yes, sir, you can turn on your camera and mic.
Yeah. Yes. Good evening, everyone. I must thank ELTAI for inviting me to make this presentation. It's a wonderful work that has been done by ELTAI in these difficult times. The one good thing which has happened, of course, is the number of webinars that I and my friends have attended. So we've got to listen to a wide range of speakers from across the world, from across India and from across the world. And ELTAI has done its bit by organizing this weekly, webinars every Sunday. I think this is the 26th webinar, right? So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to make a presentation on critical stylistics. I've titled it this way, Textual Appreciation. Initially, I thought I would title it Literary Appreciation, but I changed that, because it's not about literary texts only that I'll be talking about. I'll be talking about texts in general, all kinds of texts. So critical stylistics is something that I'll be talking about. The toolkit of critical stylistics in the time that is available. This, I gather, is being listened to by undergrad students as well. So I will keep it at the introductory level. I will just introduce people to stylistics. In this critical stylistics, in this process, of course, I'll be talking about the journey that this domain of stylistics has traversed. So very briefly, though. So I will talk about how from stylistics we have now reached critical stylistics and how what this has meant for textual appreciation. So a little more systematically, let me talk about what I intend to do today. So I would attempt to define what stylistics is or could be, right? And then, of course, map the trajectory of what is known as traditional formalist stylistics and how it led to functional stylistics. And then discuss how the intervention of theory has led to the branching off of stylistics into various subdomains, right? And then also discuss how the advent of critical stylistics, which is something that I want to focus upon, how critical stylistics has ushered in a fresh breath of life to the broad domain of stylistics, and how the tools of critical stylistics could be helpful in textual appreciation. I don't know to what extent I'll be able to do justice to the things that I intend to do today, but I will try my best. So, you know what? Let me start with a question. Some of you must be wondering whether there is a typo here. The pronoun should have been what and not who, because who in English has to have a human referent. But stylistics is an abstract concept, is the name of the discipline. So, you know, who is stylistics is possibly a erroneous, you know, question. But a stylistician would or could say that the sentence is not exactly erroneous, maybe, but it is surely linguistically and stylistically deviant. An example of what we call in, you know, Sanskrit poetics, bakrokti. You know, so it's syntactically deviant, it's linguistically deviant because it doesn't belong to the normal paradigm. It belongs to the abnormal paradigm. That's point number one. And the point number two is that it has, of course, a kind of a psychological impact on the reader or the viewer or the hearer because it is foregrounded. I'm using a word which is very commonly used in stylistics. It is foregrounded. It catches the attention of the reader.
Anindya sir, are you here? We don't hear you and we don't see you. Anindya sir, could you please turn on your camera and mic? Anindya sir?
I think Xavier sir, the connection has been lost from
No,
Anindya
he
sir.
is in the room. He is in the room.
Okay, sir.
Anindya sir, could you please turn on your camera and mic? He is not using his earphone. Probably he's not able to hear me.
Yeah, that's true.
Anindya sir, could you please turn on your mic also, camera also? Yes. Yes, sir. Now we are able to hear you. Yeah. We don't hear you, sir. Sir, we don't hear you.
No audio is there, sir. Anindya sir, enable your audio, sir.
No, sir. We don't hear you, sir. No, sir.
We are unable to hear, sir. Anindya sir.
Dear participants, please wait for a moment. The speaker is joining from another system. He has got some technical issues at the moment. He'll be joining us back within 1 or 2 minutes. Please wait. While the speaker joins, we would like to inform you about our next webinar, which is going to be held on next Sunday, that is 1st November 2020. The topic of our next webinar will be questioning skills for the classroom. Mr. Nagaraju, former principal, will join as a speaker for our next webinar. At the end of this webinar, you will get the link to join. You will get the link to register for the next webinar. Now we'll wait for the speaker to join, maybe for a minute. Anindya sir, do you hear us? Anindya sir, could you please turn on your camera and do you hear us? Sir, could you please turn on your camera? Anindya sir, do you hear us? Do you hear me? Sir, can you please turn on your camera?
Yes.
Now we can hear you. Yes.
You can hear me,
Thank
right?
you so much. Yes, sir.
I apologize for the issue on my side. My laptops are not working, both of them. I apologize for what happened. I think you can hear me. All of you can hear me very clearly right now. Okay?
Yes, sir. It's very clear.
Yeah. Thank you so
Please
much.
go. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for bearing with me. So I was talking about how this particular sentence could be regarded as erroneous by some people, but a stylistician would or could say that the sentence is not exactly erroneous, maybe, but it's surely linguistically deviant or stylistically deviant. It's an example of what in Sanskrit poetics is called vakrokti, deviation, because it doesn't belong to the normal paradigm. It belongs to the abnormal paradigm, right? So that is one point. The other point is that this particular expression is foregrounded. It has a psychological impact on the reader, the viewer, the hearer. It is foregrounded and it catches the attention of the reader. So henceforth, whatever I say, you might not be able to remember after some time, but I'm sure that many of you, most of you perhaps, wouldn't forget that I began my presentation with this particular sentence, apart from the fact that, there was some kind of a disturbance with regard to the program and we lost a lot of time. So anyway, the who in this sentence is used in a metaphorical way to refer to stylistics as a person, a friend possibly, one who would help me in my interpretive endeavor. Now, this sentence, by the way, is taken from the title of the first chapter of a book written by Mick Short and published in 1996, titled "Exploring Language of Poems, Plays, and Prose." Right. So, by engaging ourselves in exploring linguistically or stylistically deviant forms and the psychological impact those forms might have on the viewer, reader, hearer, and in trying to draw inferences, we are already involved in some kind of an analysis of style or stylistic analysis. Now, let us have a look at this sentence. I'm not using the PowerPoint. Xavier, can I do it? Can I operate it from my mobile phone? Can I?
Sir, it is possible. Do you see the slides?
Yes, I see the slides very clearly. So I will do that.
Or you can tell me, I'll be able to change the slides, sir. If you want, you can tell me.
Fine. Let's see. So we are always learning new things, right? Okay. Now let us look at this example from literature. This particular line occurs in Act 1, Scene 4 of Shakespeare's play Romeo and Juliet. Mercutio, one of the characters in the play, utters this particular sentence. Now, one of the first things that we notice here in this particular sentence is that daylight cannot normally be the object of burn. Right? What can normally be the object of burn is something which is combustible, like paper, oil, wood, fuel, etc. So one thing which is absolutely clear is that like the use of who in the earlier sentence, in this sentence also we have a metaphorical construction, and this particular sentence belongs to the abnormal paradigm. So till now what we have done is we have used our knowledge of the English language and our knowledge of the world in order to try and arrive at a kind of an interpretation, right? But to understand the sentence better, we have to see it in its context, the context of the use of this particular sentence. So if we go to the context of its occurrence in Act 1, Scene 4 of Romeo and Juliet, then we understand that burning is literal in this particular sentence, and the daylight is metaphorical. So the context, the situation is that it is dark at the time, and Mercutio, who is a friend of Romeo, when he utters this particular sentence, is referring to the burning torches, the flambeaux, that the Montagues are the Romeo party, Romeo's family, and the friends of Romeo's family. So, the situation is that Romeo and the friends of the Montagues, they're holding these burning torches in their hands, and they're waiting to gate crash a ball organized by the Capulets, the family of Juliet. And this is the occasion where Romeo and Juliet are supposed to meet for the first time. And the Montagues, Romeo and his friends, they are waiting to gate crash the Capulet ball. So this is the situation in which Mercutio makes this particular statement. So in the context of the use of daylight, we can possibly say that although we cannot physically use up daylight, like we can paper, oil, wood, fuel, etc. Daylight is a medium which we use to do a lot of things in. And if we do not use daylight properly, then we may run out of time and not be able to do what needs to be done. So in other words, burn daylight might possibly, and I'm using possibly, I'm hedging. This is only one way of looking at this particular sentence. We should be very careful. There are a lot of undergrads who are listening to me at this point in time, and this is something that I tell my students as well, that you cannot say things with absolute finality. So the hedge words are very important. That is, you be a little tentative when you are in the domain of hermeneutics, when you are interpreting texts. So this is something which is very important. You cannot close down the possibilities of interpretation that are there. So this is only one kind of interpretation. So we can say that burn daylight in this particular context might possibly refer to wasting of time. So Mercutio is possibly saying that the Montagues should not be wasting any further time. They should be immediately gate crashing the Capulet ball and letting this opportunity for Romeo and Juliet to meet for the first time. So now what we have done is we have based our knowledge, or we have done a kind of an interpretive activity, and we have used our knowledge of the English language, our knowledge of the world, and contextual knowledge, right, as the basis for inferring what seems to be an appropriate interpretation, right? Now imagine this particular sentence occurring in an article on soil conservation in the 21st century. It is highly improbable that a sentence like the metaphorical sentence like this, appears in a scientific article on soil conservation. But imagine this kind of a sentence appears in an article on soil conservation, as Mick Short suggests in his book. This example is also taken from Mick Short's book. So this interpretation, because of the change of the context, could obviously drastically change. The utterance could then be possibly understood as a kind of an injunction to use solar heating as a source of heat and light instead of coal or oil or gas that we normally use. Now, having looked at these two sentences, the second one from literature, can we move to the next slide? Yeah, there we go. Yeah. So in the next slide, I have some kind of, I said in the beginning, while telling you about the trajectory of this particular deliberation, that I'd be attempting a kind of a definition of stylistics. Now, this is, one definition of stylistics which I have liked over a period of time. This appears in Short's book, which I already mentioned, page 27. So stylistic analysis is a method of linking linguistic form via reader inference to interpretation in a detailed way, and thereby providing as much explicit evidence as possibly for and against particular interpretations of texts. Right? So let us move to the next slide. Yeah. So what I do, we have lost a lot of time, but I will still, attempt to do this. Right? Very briefly, though, brief history of stylistics. I'm doing this because we need to understand how we came to critical stylistics. Right? So any discussion of history, I'm trying to run through the history. Right? So any discussion on history, you pick up any book on stylistics, that book will tell you that you must begin by addressing the relationship of stylistics to its earliest known predecessor, classical rhetoric, which was one of the most prestigious of the 7 liberal arts in the Western classical tradition. Now, its fundamental preoccupation was with the art of persuasion, focusing on the linguistic abilities that a speaker required to achieve a desired effect on the listeners. The Greek rhetoricians, for example, were particularly interested in the tropes and devices that were used by orators for effective argument and persuasion. So if you talk about modern stylistics, then modern stylistics can be said to have traced its roots to the formalist tradition that developed through two interrelated movements in linguistics, known as Russian formalism and Prague school structuralism at the beginning of the 20th century. So who were the key figures of these two interrelated movements? Shklovsky, Tomaszewski, Mukarovsky, and of course Roman Jakobson was one of the founding members of the formalist group in Moscow, but later moved to Prague in 1920. So what these scholars did was, all of these scholars had a common purpose. And that common purpose was making literary scholarship more scientific, more objective. So they attempted to make methodological investigations of literary texts in order to understand what accounted for the literariness of these texts. Both these linguistic movements influenced the growth of two approaches toward literary studies, as we know: new criticism in America and practical criticism in Britain. Now, these developments gradually paved the way for the evolution of stylistics as a distinct area of academic inquiry during the 1960s. In fact, in 1960 was published this book by C.B. Style in Language, and this publication is usually considered to be the starting point for the growth of stylistics. So the early stylistic work was formalist in nature, and its sole objective was to study the intricate patterning of literary texts. However, this kind of stylistic inquiry gave rise to a lot of problems. The primary focus of formalist method of investigation into text was to provide a detailed account of the linguistic features of a literary text in order to account for its literariness. But a mere list of linguistic features could not be counted as an interpretation of a text, as it failed to give an account of how these features participated in the generation of meaning. So in addition to this, formalist stylistics kept itself absolutely aloof from eclecticism. It didn't allow cross-fertilization between itself and Marxisms, feminisms, and so on to happen. So this is possibly one of the reasons why critical theory kept itself out of bounds for stylistics, right? Now it's no longer the case, of course, but this was the case. This was possibly one of the reasons why critical theory kept itself absolutely out of bounds for stylistics. Now, one book, because a lot of undergraduates are listening, one book which is very important with regard to this is A Beginning Theory by Peter Barry, where he included stylistics as one of the chapters, chapter 11, right? So this never happened before that, I believe. Right, next slide, please. Okay, so during the 1970s, the tide began to change towards a different approach to linguistics, which came to be known as functionalism. The functionalist approach in stylistics grew up in the 1970s under the influence of Michael Halliday. This new approach tried to bridge the gap between analysis and interpretation by making the stylistic analysis of a text functional. So stylisticians who subscribed to the functionalist model considered a formal stylistic feature relevant only when it was functional from the interpretive point of view. So there was thus a movement from text in itself, and this movement is very important, text in itself to text in context. So gradually what happened is factors such as gender, race, and class, in the Indian context, caste, which traditionally didn't find any place in any stylistic analysis, which was confined to treating the text in isolation, found their way into stylistics, right? What happened as a result of this was that there was a gradual branching off of stylistics into, domains like radical stylistics, feminist stylistics, critical stylistics, and so on. Next slide. So in the 1980s and early 1990s, stylistics started being influenced by development in critical linguistics, or what came to be known as critical discourse analysis. Now, this critical discourse analysis aimed at studying texts from an avowedly Marxist perspective. Now, this actually was very problematic for critical statisticians like Leslie Jeffries, for instance, who felt that they could not conceive of a linguistic approach which takes a narrowly political view as axiomatic. As Jeffries points out in this particular entry titled Critical Stylistics in the Routledge Handbook of Stylistics, from where I've quoted in this slide, and in a book, 2010 book, Critical Stylistics, from where I've drawn material to talk about critical stylistics today. So Leslie Jeffries very clearly points out that it is simply not credible that the things left-wing people might want to criticize in text might not also be the same things that others would like to criticize in texts produced by the former. So, of course, the dominance of capitalism and right-wing views has led to the creation and growth of a particular kind of press and a particular kind of privileged opinion makers. And I'm sure, people will be immediately able to make a connection with what I've just said to the situation in India at this point in time. I mean, the moment you switch on your television sets, you hear many of these people masquerading as journalists, involving themselves in mudslinging and so on and so forth. So, of course, this kind of this creation of privileged opinion makers needs to be critiqued, certainly. However, the question is, why shouldn't a method of textual analysis be not interested in unraveling the ideological underpinnings of all kinds of texts? That's the fundamental issue, and that's what Leslie Jeffries talks about. She says in this particular slide, you can see this quotation from her entry titled Critical Stylistics, that critical statisticians like her, they were not ready to abandon stylistics' hard-won scientific credibility by giving up on all attempts at objectivity, rigor, and replicability. So, next slide. There we are. So, what does critical stylistics do? So, at the heart of critical stylistics is the idea that the text or the utterance will use the resources of the language, in our case it's English, to present a particular view of the world, or in the case of literature, of a fictional world. So what the analyst or the researcher needs to do is to work out what the text is doing, how it is presenting the text world. There is a wonderful book which you may wish to read up. It's on text world theory, published in 2007 by Gaddens. Please look up that book. It's very interesting. That's a different guy. I'm tempted to speak about the relationship between text world theory and critical stylistics, but because of the paucity of time, how much time do I have, Zebia? Can I go on for say around 15-20 minutes?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, this is what critical stylistics attempts to do. So, next slide, please. So, it has, it has a toolkit of certain tools, right? The tools of analysis. These are known as textual, conceptual functions. I'm coming to those tools tools which are mentioned by Leslie Jeffries in her 2010 book, right? So what are these textual conceptual functions? The idea of textual conceptual functions in general is that they try to capture what a text is doing conceptually in presenting the world, or a fictional world in the case of literature, in a particular way. In doing so, they also explain how the resources of the linguistic system are being used to produce this conceptual meaning. That this is the textual part of the process, and what defines, and this is what defines this approach as essentially stylistic. Next slide, Xavier. So here is the list of the 10 textual conceptual functions that Leslie Jeffries mentions in her book, and she warns us not to consider this list to be exhaustive. People who are working in this particular tradition may wish to add more textual conceptual functions. So naming and describing, right? Representing actions, events, states, equating and contrasting, exemplifying and enumerating, prioritizing, implying and assuming, negating, hypothesizing, presenting other speech and thoughts, representing time, space, and society. So what I will do is, in a few slides a little later, I will just focus on a few things, on a few textual conceptual functions like prioritizing, naming and describing, and representing actions, events, and states with some examples. Before that, Xavier, next slide. Before that, you consider the following scenario. Just read through. Take 1 minute to read through. Now, yeah. So it deals with this breaking of a vase by an employee. And, how this can possibly be represented. So I'm using very simple examples. Right. Now, this example is taken from a very important book on, language point of view, published in 1993 by one of the foremost stylisticians, Paul Simpson. And that book is titled Language, Ideology, and Point of View, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So what are the possibilities that that person has in order to represent? Next slide, Xavier. So there are 4 possibilities, possibly. One is, the first one is a very straightforward possibility, an upfront approach. So I broke the vase. So here the doer has been placed first, whereas the object affected has been positioned last, right? But of course, your boss might be appreciative of this kind of an upfront approach, and maybe the boss respects this kind of an approach, but maybe not. So what are the other options that you have? Look at the second option. The vase was broken by me. So what you've done is you've passivized the earlier sentence, you've rearranged the original sequence of information. The object affected is now placed first, whilst the agent responsible for the breakage is now shifted towards the end of the sentence, right? But even this might not be okay, might not be all right with you. So you actually feel like removing the doer of the process. Even that can be done, So look at the third option. The vase was broken, right? But this warrants a question like, by who? Who broke this vase? So maybe you then decide to excise completely from this process the doer, that is you, right? Fending off that awkward question, who by? So what you do is you can opt for the fourth option, which is the verb broke. Because broke is an ergative verb, it offers these choices. So what basically I want to point out is that these 4 possibilities considered here, they represent different ways of encoding in language our experience of a particular event. Something has happened and circumstances dictate that we must select words to describe it. In this particular, in this case, the particular selections which we make are from the system of transitivity in English. Okay, next slide. Let us go to a few textual, conceptual functions that we talked about in an earlier slide. Look at this example. So this example is, of course, a concocted example, but it is absolutely possible that one might have come across this kind of a sentence. Now here, what I've dealt with largely is the textual conceptual function of prioritizing. Now, having said this, I would like to point out that the textual conceptual functions that Leslie Jeffries talks about cannot be divided into watertight compartments. There are lots of overlaps. So, for instance, when talking about prioritizing information, right, in text production, of course, naming and describing and representing events, they also would become important. But here we focus upon prioritizing information. So look at possibly the 3 things which are very important. Possibly 3 things. There could be many more things. First is the naming process. And there is, it is absolutely clear that in the naming process, the text producer comes across as someone who is who has a favorable opinion of Prime Minister Modi. So look at this. Prime Minister Modi gave Indians the details of how, after the lockdown period is over, he will work to increase jobs and lower healthcare costs. While the leader of the Congress party. Now look at the naming process here. Prime Minister Modi is named. His position is named very clearly right in the beginning. But look at how the leader of the Congress party is not named. Now, because of the pronoun which is there after this expression, we assume that it is Sonia Gandhi who is being talked about. So even in the naming process, there is a kind of bias, that is absolutely clear. So that is first thing. Now, what we have, if you look at it from the point of view of language, then you see that there are 2 parts of this particular sentence. One is the first part, which is an independent clause, where information about Modi is there. And then you have a subordinate clause where information about the leader of the Congress party is there. So, the 2 seemingly equivalent clauses are actually different kinds of clauses. They occur in different kinds of structures. So from the point of view of critical stylistics, it would be worthwhile perhaps to investigate the correlations between subordination and power to demonstrate the indexical relationships that can be built into texts with ideological intentions. So that is one thing. And the other thing is very thing which immediately catches our attention perhaps is the use of the factive verb in the second part of the sentence. You know how factive verbs function when you use a factive verb like showed here, right? So what you actually mean to say is that the information that follows the factive verb has to be understood as true, right? So while Prime Minister Modi gave Indians the details of all the things that he will do after the lockdown, the leader of the Congress party showed that she was unable to give Indians the straight talk and the straight answers they deserve. So you can see how the ideological underpinnings are there this particular text is produced by someone who is, who favors Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Modi's politics and policies. Okay, next slide, please. Now let's go to another function, that is naming and describing. Now consider the following structures, the structures which occur towards the bottom of the slide, and look at how information is or isn't packaged with evaluative phrases, pointing towards their ideological underpinnings. So there are three important things which become significant in this particular textual, when you consider this particular textual conceptual function. What are those three things? The three things are the relatively straightforward case in which a noun is chosen from the alternatives which are available. That's the first thing, the choosing of the nouns for naming and for describing, right? Then the next thing is the question of what other information is included within the boundaries of the noun phrases. That's the second thing. And the third thing is the way in which processes and actions, which are standardly described in English by verbs, may be converted into nouns by a process called nominalization, with certain ideological consequences. So look at this, these expressions, sentences. Not all are complete sentences, actually. The government announced the lockdown. This is pretty straightforward. But look at how the nominalization has happened. And this nominalization actually makes this expression incomplete. But this nominalization is important because possibly the text producer will include more information. So the government announced the lockdown, the announcement of the lockdown by the government, right? The announcement of the lockdown by the government was a terrible mistake. The announcement of the lockdown by the government was an unavoidable necessity. So you know that the earlier sentence, the announcement of the lockdown by the government was a terrible mistake, can occur in a newspaper or on television channels which are not very favorable to Prime Minister Modi and the government, and the next sentence would be possibly there in newspapers and news channels which favor the government. Now look at how you can package more information with the use of adjectives, how adjectives are used. Look at how the same basic structure can be used, to put forward your ideas. The evaluative expression, the ridiculous, right? In the penultimate sentence, the ridiculous announcement of the disastrous lockdown. Look at the use of the adjectives, right, to represent this particular situation. Look at the last one, right? So next slide, please. So this is the last example that I have. But look at this example. This example is culled from Jeffrey's book, 2010 book, Critical Stylistics. In this example, what you have is you have three sentences, right? These three sentences are taken from an article which Tony Blair, the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, wrote in 2007. This article appeared in Times, right? So look at the first sentence. So what we have in the first sentence is, first of all, the nominalization of absconding, right? So abscond is a verb. Now it has been nominalized, it has been made a noun with a particular purpose. The nominalization of the verb actually allows the author, Tony Blair, to expand the noun phrase by having prepositional phrases, as you can see. And this points to this packaged up information. Now, this article was written in the context of protests from certain quarters, protest against the Tony Blair government. The government was actually trying to introduce something like the Aadhaar card that we have in our country. And there were lots of protests. So Tony Blair was responding to this, right? So he said the absconding of 3 people on control orders because of suspicion of their involvement in terrorism has once again thrown into sharp relief the debate about terrorism and civil liberty. Now look at the second sentence. The second sentence actually alludes to this argument against his government with regard to the introduction of ICALs, as I already said. So what Tony Blair does is, Tony Blair uses an intensive relational verb, is, to refute the arguments and to talk about his status quo. Because the police anyway, even without the introduction of the I-cards, the police and the security services can engage in surveillance. Right. Look at the third sentence. The third sentence is very interesting. Look at the 2 powerful verbs that Tony Blair uses. Remove, in critical stylistics terms, these verbs, these powerful verbs are called material action intentional verbs, right? The powerful material action intentional verbs, remove and replace. But this we, here, if you're talking about this naming process, the we is rather vague. Who are we? So possibly he's referring to the British people and the Americans, maybe the British government and the American government who are allies. So there is some kind of a vagueness, but we understand that it refers to the 2 governments maybe, and also implicitly includes the British and the American people. So we remove 2 utterly brutal and dictatorial regimes. We replace them with a United Nations supervised democratic process. And the Muslims in both countries, so he's referring to the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? So we remove the 2 utterly brutal and dictatorial regimes, and we replace them with a United Nations supervised democratic process. And the Muslims in both countries, look how he identifies the citizens of Iraq and Afghanistan by their religion. And look at how, in the later part of the sentence, they are represented as a relatively passive recipient. They only get the chance to vote, because of the saviors, the British and the Americans. So they're actors, if they're actors at all, if they get a chance to vote, they're actors only in the subordinate sense. So in critical stylistics, what you do is you are involved in this kind of analysis for
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Chowdhury, for very erudite talk. You have covered based on the topic, and it really went on well. We appreciate you, though we had a technical glitch in the beginning. We were really tense, but it really went on well. We appreciate you. It's really interesting. I could see the participants kept on pouring their messages, appreciating. And of course, there are also a lot of questions to be answered, but I think since we are running short of time, the questions or queries may be sent to you, and once we receive the feedback, we'll try to send them back to the participants through email. So we thank you very much, sir. Thank you, for the time that you gave us, and the talk, for these participants. We are happy that your talk was very well received, as we can see from the participants in the chat box. So, there are quite a few more questions, of course, that we need to be answered. Perhaps we will have one more session with you very soon. Thanks again for finding time for us, sir. I also thank all the participants for attending the webinar and benefiting from it. We hope to see you all next Sunday once again for another webinar, and that is going to be, that is going to be on questioning skills for the classroom by Professor Nagaraj. That is going to be on Sunday, 1st November 2020. You can see the banner that is visible. Thank you all. And there is no feedback form for today's session. All those who attend the entire session will get a certificate of participation by email within 5 working days. Thank you, one and all.